Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're down to the final list, the top 25 albums of 2013. This year, I reviewed 135 albums, and frankly, I should have done more. But I feel it's a plenty big sample to discuss my choices, and all of these that definitely earned their slots on this list. I'll also try to keep this as quick as I possibly can, no promises, but I've already talked about most of these albums in detail, and you should all go check out my reviews of the albums as a whole if you want a more in-depth discussion. Also, my list isn't exactly going to correspond with any common critical consensus. There have been albums that I picked that have been ignored, and certain albums that some critics lauded that I didn't find nearly as strong. So you got all that? Good, because we're not waiting any longer. Let's get this started. Number 25. Now, progressive rock and metal gets snubbed more often than it should. Let's change that, shall we? Yeah, it did deal more in arch concepts than in devastatingly precise attacks, and no, it's not quite as good as the Paradox Hotel, but Desolation rose with the Flower King's attempt to ask tough questions about politics, media, religion, and humanity's place in the world, and if nothing else, the band absolutely kills it here. The melodies are rich and well-textured, the vocal interplay is phenomenal, and the band's upward-looking optimism adds a real populist swell to an album that could have very quickly become preachy and insufferable. Yes, it's not quite as instrumentally brilliant as Dream Theater's self-titled album, but it has got a tighter focus, and the hooks are more striking and memorable, and the climaxes are just a shade stronger. Nice work, Flower Kings. Looking forward to seeing more from you. Number 24. Ugh. Well, might as well get this over with. Let me state right out of the gate that I have personal issues with Vampire Weekend. For me, they're a very good band with a fantastic gift for hooks and intelligent songwriting that have a lot of problems with artistic framing. And while Modern Vampires of the City does take a number of steps to acquire something of a little bit more of a populist spirit in discussing the problems of modern youth with great detail, it's a lot of text without subtext, so a lot of well-structured statements about myopic detachment, but by mirroring that detachment in delivery and instrumentation and in the lyrics, the album does lose a certain amount of impact. Now, fortunately for everyone, a lot of that text was still excellently written with occasional real nuggets of wit and insight that was paired with phenomenal instrumentation, which was enough to land Modern Vampires of the City on this list. Okay, Vampire Weekend, I'll give you another shot. Number 23. The artist behind this album was threatening his label that he'd make this album for years. If I was his label, I would have taken him up on that threat years ago.
I was a rolling stone, my feet never touched.
It can be awkward when some artists experiment with other genres, but for Alan Jackson, he steps into bluegrass like a comfortable pair of jeans and delivers an excellent album along the way. The instrumentation and production is organic, textured, and delivered with superb skill. Alan Jackson's delivery is emotive and passionate, and his songwriting manages to fit within traditional bluegrass without sounding like a throwback. Yes, for most bluegrass fans, the tempo is a little slow, but I'll take brilliant songwriting from a master over speed any day of the week. Nice work, Alan Jackson. Number 22. You know, I think I'm the only critic who covered this album. There are a number of things wrong with that, and the fact that this album reached my list should be evidence enough. Yes, I know what this sounds like. Backpacker rap that's apparently even too underground for YouTube. But LMNO's serious technical chops, layered and detailed songwriting, and Evidence's top-of-the-line production lends the album more unique flavor and personality than any dozen luxury or trap hip-hop albums that I heard this year. And that's not even touching on the subject matter, which sees the shallowness of most mainstream rap and just scoffs. Looking to the back, not with nostalgia, but with the grim acknowledgement that things have only seemed to deteriorate since this sort of rap, at least the backpacking style of rap that LMNO puts forward, was the norm. Either way, After the Fact is phenomenal, and both LMNO and Evidence deserve a lot more support. Check it out, all of you. Number 21. Who would have thought one of the best rock albums of the year would have come from a band not taking themselves nearly as seriously and having fun? It's Pearl Jam's best album since the mid-90s, and yet it reflects the vast departure in sound from the grunge of their debut. And you know what? It works for them! In a year where good rock albums were thematically looking to shake up the established formula, Lightning Bolt was one of the stronger ones. Not quite all that nuanced or all that deep, but buoyed by Eddie Vedder's surge of energy and some of the most radio-friendly, upbeat hooks of their career. And while I wish that the album had been able to maintain that kick-ass tempo that drives the best tracks on the album, Lightning Bolt still manages to strike with flair and style that should embarrass younger rock bands into complete silence. Number 20. Yeah, sure, it's a late entry, but that doesn't mean it doesn't belong on this list.
Swimming in the snifter, pretty as a picture. Don't get it twisted, man.
Dessa's Part of Speech might not be her strongest album or most strikingly well written, but still manages to cook with a lot of passion and phenomenal songwriting. A collection of loosely linked short stories exploring lost connections and the choices to either revive them or leave them in the dust. Dessa may have opted to use more of an R&B flavor over hip-hop, but she still manages to make it work incredibly well thanks to her emotionally compelling voice, strikingly intelligent lyrics, and a passionate undercurrent that adds desperate immediacy to the entire record. I checked this album out later than I should have, but I'm more than glad that I did. Number 19. There were few independent acts that I checked out this year that had the polish, wit, and depth of this act. Hell, there were few acts anywhere that did.
If you are afraid, come.
That Vienna Tang isn't selling out stadiums with her brand of soulful yet energetic indie pop is a goddamn crime. And Ames provided just another fresh back of evidence to the pile there, with a polished grasp for powerful melodies, an a cappella sensibility that allowed the creation of exquisite harmonies, and lyrics exploring adventure and technology with striking nuance and impeccable framing. Vienna Tang proved that layered, detailed, intelligent pop music is still an option on the table. You just need to level up and find it. Number 18. Now, it's an open secret in synth pop that most of it doesn't have to make any sense or be about much of anything so long as the music kicks ass. So when bands do go above and beyond, I notice.
And if I recover, will you be my...
Make no mistake here, CHVRCHES is not playing it safe, with an album statement nothing less than taking various targets down a peg for their hubris and showing how their dreams are nothing but worthless ash and dust. And one can make the argument they're talking to the audience. Yet it's the album that shows the willingness to second guess its own mission statement, providing flavor and nuance and second chances, and then show the hapless target finally reaching the personal revelation that he desperately needed. The fact that the album was damn near amazing with strident and crisp instrumentation and production matched with Lauren Mayberry's strident and assertive delivery only made the story all the sweeter. For a debut synth pop album, you can't exactly ask for more than that. Number 17. The fact that this album wasn't a failure is a miracle in and of itself. The fact that it turned out as great as it did says something in and of itself in an entirely different vein.
It all went blank, all I remember is feeling ridiculous cause I was getting sick of this feeling like I'm always...
Now, many acts make sequels to previous albums as just a way to drum up hype. Eminem chose instead to make a follow-up record that not only returned to the thematic progressions and dangling threads left after the first Marshall Mathers LP, but then expanded on them with the benefit of added context and nuance. The album is bombastic, frequently hilarious, and yet shockingly nuanced, framing in plain view the subtext that has long underscored Eminem's work. That Slim Shady is a vile, hateful, disgusting creature no matter how insanely talented he is. And the fact that we not only listened, but gave him fame and success says far more about our culture than it does about him. Just as Slim Shady is Eminem's warped reflection, it's ours as well. And yet, despite that, it's still a phenomenal album and perhaps Eminem's most optimistic and brightest to date. So in a world where so many people are looking downwards, what the hell does that say about us? Number 16. It doesn't take much for an artist to sell out. It takes a ton to use that sellout as the underlying thematic progression of your album and then turn it into a satirical slam dunk.
Am I just wasting our time?
Icon for Hire's left turn towards electronic rock and metal did alienate some fans, I must admit this, but the album turned into something really something special when it turned the entire shift into direction into the theme and overall conceit of the album, showing that not only could the band make great music in a more electronically driven vein, but provide plenty of biting, punk-inspired commentary on the shift, answering the critical jibes even before they were made. As an album, it's a showcase for Ariel's incredible range for a performer, and the band's sheer earnestness in their presentation makes it clear that If they were gonna sell out, they were going to do it in the best possible way. And you know what? They pulled it off. Don't be dismayed by the fact that this group is on a Christian label. Icon for Hire is so much better than their roots. Number 15. Now there's some acts that are just looking to entertain. These guys aim to do the exact opposite, and they managed to make it work, and it landed on my list. Now there are plenty of acts that tried to build their appeal this year by being scary or threatening, and most of them sucked. But the Flaming Lips, they went for something more cerebral and chilling with the terror, flipping the idealistic acid high of their former albums into the alienating chill of the acid freakout. An album that explores human weakness and how the loss of love can turn you into a wretched shell of a human being, all exposed through half-heard lyrics, droning thunder, and omnipresent feel of unearthly noise and menacing cacophony. The Terror was the album that I played on Halloween because it scared the crap out of me in the best possible way. Number 14. Now, if you'd only listened to mainstream country throughout this year, you'd have thought that no women besides Taylor Swift and the token Miranda Lambert or Carrie Underwood appearance were successful. Let's change that mistaken impression, shall we?
All while you were.
I'll admit that Brandy Clark's debut album probably didn't resonate with me in the same way because it's aimed at a slightly different demographic, but I can still recognize incredibly solid quality and real texture when I see it. With 90s Reba McEntire-esque production, instrumentation, and vocals, but with a songwriting far superior, Brandy Clark's 12 stories are vulnerable, emotionally gripping, and shockingly relatable in their nuanced presentation of the life for modern women. And with the confidence to take real risk in framing the subject matter, it's easily one of the best country albums of the year. Looking forward to more from you, Brandy. Now, number 13. I've always shunned the term guilty pleasure, but if I'm looking at albums that would appeal to me in all the right ways without even trying, yeah, this is the book. Yeah, it's all so much late 70s kitsch and camp, frequently over the top and soaked in a retro style that seems the antithesis of modern cool. But look, I don't care. Franz Ferdinand's fourth album just works for me, and its flagrant embrace of theatricality almost for its own sake, fused with killer pop hooks, phenomenal bass lines, and the lead singer Alexis Sopranos' most varied performance yet. It's an album that frequently feels paranoid, delusional, and soaked in unrequited ego, but you know what? That's all part of the point. The earnest emotions are tempered in sarcasm, and the pompous lunacy is embraced just enough to prove that sometimes its own delusions of insanity and grandeur can be kind of awesome if you just believe in it enough. Fine work, guys. Number 12. Oh, I've been cheering for this band since the beginning, and when their EP came out this year, oh god, it was worth it.
Even if the light is burning out.
Yeah, I know, it's a 6-song EP, but goddamn if it didn't earn this spot for sheer pop rock greatness and being better than the majority of the albums released this year. Refreshingly organic pop rock with a great melodic focus and talent across the board, the Brilliancy easily leaped above their immediate comparison of Jimmy Eat World with better production, a stronger vocal performance from Austin Leadley, and strikingly sharp songwriting that sticks with traditional subject matter but does it extremely well. This band has a level of professionalism, polish, and skill that you rarely see from a debut rock act, and I would not be surprised if you don't hear a lot more from the Brilliancy from them very, very soon. Number 11. I may have said a number of times that acoustic indie acts, or acts that are a little bit quieter in that vein, they aren't normally my thing. Here's the big exception to that rule.
Drinking while sleeping.
The best way to describe Dream River is poetic, as Bill Callahan trades his typical melancholy for a bit of a lighter touch on this richly textured, incredibly detailed album that managed to really hit me in ways I wasn't expecting. It was an album filled with ongoing motifs and symbolism surrounding central themes of travel, lacking a true home and little connections. A Dream River is an album that requires effort and a certain amount of patience to completely take in, but my god, when you do so, it's worth it. The former frontman of Smog has really made something quietly beautiful and really something very special, and everybody, and I mean everybody, should have heard it. Number 10. I said this was going to make this list when I reviewed this album, and I wasn't lying.
We won't break the fall.
No, it's not quite as wildly experimental as the ArchAndroid, but Janelle Monae's venture back in time to 70s and 80s funk disco and R&B plays amazing dividends in this energetic, amazingly fun, and yet brilliantly poignant album. I'll admit once again that I'm not the primary audience for this album, but here it matters even less because Janelle Monae's tale of romance stretches beyond race, gender, and sexuality entirely intentionally, and it's fused with great music that has a ton of flair and gorgeous melody. Not to mention guest stars that actually contribute well and understand the ongoing story. And Janelle Monae's vocal performance might be her best yet, taking material that is clearly deeply personal and performing it with nuance, soul, and a ton of passion. It might not have stretched her range all that far, but it felt like it meant all the much more. Do not miss this album because it is awesome. Number 9. You know, I honestly thought this album would have ended up being a little bit higher on my list, but you know what? It definitely belongs here all the same because it rocks.
Like the legend of the Phoenix.
Daft Punk's long love letter to the music of the past wasn't just a throwback to the era of funk and disco, but an exploration of the album concept, and it was incredible. Easily the best produced album of the year, Daft Punk proved yet again that they have the uncanny knack for bringing people together in euphoric appreciation of just a pair of robots trying to connect with the world. And in the process, they made one of the most emotionally compelling and moving albums of the year. And paralleling the creative process with the search for love and connection, and showing the circular feedback relationship between artists and their audience in the creation and exploration of art, Daft Punk said more about the craft of making music this year than any other act. And you know what? They still managed to make me want to dance. Number 8. Granted, Daft Punk weren't the only band to call back to the 70s with some powerful results, and let's talk about these ladies, shall we? A love letter to post-punk that seems to disregard traditional expressions of love, Savage's debut album was blunt, curt, to the point, and seething with contempt at those who scorn their sex-positive embrace of third-wave feminism. Every instrument, from the fuzz-saturated guitar riffs, the menacing bass lines, to the surprisingly intricate drum sections, contributes to the tightly controlled compositions that seemed like they would explode at any second, leading to a bleak, nerve-wracking tension that underscores each track. And Jenny Beth's Susie-esque gravitas only underscores the darkness of this album. Gothic, grimy, and yet addictive and compelling. You don't often see debut albums like this in this vein, so confident and so strong. Number 7. So okay, you're a band that's been around since the late 60s and you're on your 19th album. What do you do?
It's gonna be hell!
Well, I advise doing what Deep Purple did, which is make one of the best albums of their career, rife with solid songwriting, fantastic hooks, plenty of experimentation, and some of the best technical musicianship of the year. I'm not joking, this is a musician's album, and some of the time signature shifting and incredible solos suggest a borderline progressive rock approach to crafting great rock songs. And yet the entire album just blows through it with the comfort and skill that only comes with veteran performers at their absolute peak. They're trying to everything and anything, including a goth rock tribute to Vincent Price that reached Steinman-esque levels of mad epicness not because they have to, but because why the hell not? Criminally ignored by most, Deep Purple's Now What is one of the band's best records. And if the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame requires any more evidence to why this band should have been inducted years ago, well, this is it. Enjoy. Number 6. And in the spirit of veterans trying something new and awesome, we have this.
Shot that run the jewels.
It's an album that has a very simple focus, but does exactly what it needs to do. Assert how Killer Mike and LP are better than their competition. And not just because of wealth or status, but because they're better rappers and producers and brought intellect and phenomenally well-layered wordplay to a genre that didn't always have it this year. And while we can all wish that both men had opted to aim a little bit higher in the righteous smackdown of anything and everything that got in their way, Run the Jewels is still the best hip-hop album of the year in terms of intricate production, hard-hitting wordplay, and moments of real potent insight if you're willing to hunt for them through the lyrics. And LP, Killer Mike, you keep threatening to make more of these albums. Yeah, I'll take you up on that any day of the week. I'm looking forward to it. Number 5. And now for something completely different. A man who has convinced himself he is decidedly not awesome in the slightest, and yet made one of the best albums of the year.
If I stay here
trouble will
It's difficult to make albums exploring depression, misery, and existential ennui without sounding more than a little insufferable, and yet somehow, this year the National cracked the code, paring back the gloss and chamber pop of High Violet into something rougher and closer to their country roots, and dear God, it worked. The band frames the downward spiral appropriately through a series of vignettes that show the mistakes made and trouble found by the narrator, all delivered through Matt Berenger's soulful delivery, and the National's smart balance between quiet melancholy and moments that roiled with force and real drama. And with the songwriting that was never better and the nuanced framing impeccably placed, the National delivered one of the darkest albums of their career, and yet one of the most relatable and human all the same. Number 4. But you know what? Sometimes you need a change from stagnant depression, and Josh Homme has the answer.
if I had a time.
This was an album about reaching a tipping point and snapping out of inertia, creating something fresh and new and potent and moving on with your life, and Queens of the Stone Age did just that with Like Clockwork, one of the best albums of their critically acclaimed career. Unparalleled instrumentation, Josh Homme showing off his impressive range vocally and in songwriting, riffs that stuck in the memory unlike any others that I heard this year, and an album progression that has shocking insight into the process and emotions of breaking free and trying something new and moving on. Like Clockwork felt like anything but its title, and that's a high compliment indeed. Number 3. Now this album, it won me over fairly early this year, and it's always the one I hold up when people said that country music wasn't worth defending or reviewing, because this album is living proof of why they are so very, very wrong.
Mama's hooked on Mary Kay, brother's hooked on.
In a year where mainstream country got drunk, macho, and stupid, Kacey Musgraves took a third path and found a folk-drenched version of country that had texture, insight, and reality that seemed far beyond her years. To say nothing of a grasp of technical songwriting chops and an emotive delivery that goes so far beyond for a debut album at least. And yet the album goes for so much more than beautifully composed and organic songs, but a progressive message and a slap upside the head to the traditional values and southern pandering that lingers over country for good or for ill. What makes matters even better is that Kacey's framing of the bleak, dusty, rural inertia is honest and crushingly sad, as she admits that she only has pieces of the answer and sometimes feels just as trapped. And yet, Kacey Musgraves represents something a lot bigger, even if it's just a mainstream country. She's a voice of hope and a voice of change, and hers is one of many that chimed up in favor of traditional and neo-traditional country this year. And considering that she won New Artist of the Year at the CMAs, it looks like somebody is finally listening, and thank God for that. Number 2. It was my most anticipated album of the year, and Ayreon, he didn't disappoint. I'm still blown away to this day by The Theory of Everything, if only because of the sheer ambition and scope that rises to the heights of Ayreon Lukinson's writing career. It's not so much an album about finding a physics equation, but about how geniuses communicate with the rest of the world at large that they feel above the benefits and costs of mind-expanding drugs, academic and intellectual rivalry, and ambitions that span family generations, and the tremendous cost that is often paid to achieve those ambitions. In that, Ayreon returned to the humanity of his masterpiece, The Human Equation, to deliver a phenomenally monumental piece of symphonically gorgeous and incredibly moving progressive metal. And his all-star cast of singers and musicians deliver some of their best work of their entire careers. It's an album that dares to be intelligent, trusts the audience to keep up and follow along, and then brings together a raw and beautifully composed portrait of humanity to display in ways that I don't think any other album managed this year. I cannot stress how moving and beautiful and impacting I found this record. And it would have very nearly topped my list, except for one album that's been atop it for almost the entire damn year. And most of you probably already know what it is. Number 1. It took 5 years, and a change in the lineup, and its style entirely. But he did it again. And if you've been following my reviews at all throughout this year from back in my blog, you already know what album I'm talking about. It's one of his most oblique, confusing, and impenetrable albums to date, a far cry from the straightforward bloodbath that was Murder Ballads or the heartbreak that spurred Boatman's Call. It's an album that uses sparse sound and minimalist affectations to draw you in and have you thinking about every single word that was sung and spoken, painting a picture in muted, empty shades. It's an album where Nick Cave rarely raises his voice into the screaming howls of his last album, Dig Lazarus Dig, or even the Grinderman Project, but cryptic whispers that mean so much more than they deign to tell, assuming that the audience will be able to follow along and eventually get it. And while it took listen after listen for me to finally untap and to figure out the true secrecy of this album, each listen revealing something new, Push the Sky Away finally made sense. A stark, uncompromising painting of the modern human condition, touching on privacy, moral standards and the lack thereof, religion, the creative process, innocence lost, and humanity's sacrifice of thought and knowledge over data. An album that exposes that we've only soared higher and higher, we've become lesser and lesser along the way. And Push the Sky Away does not shy away from exposing human frailties and weaknesses in the audience, in society at large, and especially in Nick Cave himself. And yet, even with that, he whispers that we must keep going, because look, the sky's the limit. And even if it's just rock and roll, we need to keep pushing. Push that sky away. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Push the Sky Away, my favorite album and the best album of 2013. Let's hope for more next year. But until then, I'll see you next time.